He spent the night wrapped around his mistress while his wife gave birth alone. When Grant Calloway finally came home at dawn, every lock had been changed. On the porch sat his newborn son's hospital bracelet and a note in her handwriting. You missed his first breath. You won't miss his last. What happened next? He had her committed to a psychiatric ward, froze every bank account, took her baby, turned her own parents against her. He thought he'd broken her. He was wrong. This is the story of a woman who lost everything and burned down the man who took it. Stay until the end. Trust me, the revenge is worth it. If stories like this hit different, subscribe and drop a comment. Let's begin. Grant Calloway pulled into his driveway at 6:47 in the morning, the Charleston sky still holding on to the last gray threads of night. His black Mercedes gleamed under the streetlight as he cut the engine and sat there for a moment, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror, a hint of lipstick on his collar. He wet his thumb and rubbed it away, watching the pink smear disappear into nothing. The house stood dark against the brightening sky. No porch light, no warm glow from the kitchen where Vivian usually made her morning tea. The nursery window on the second floor was shut tight, curtains drawn. Grant frowned. She always left those curtains open. She said the morning light was good for the baby. He grabbed the bouquet of roses from the passenger seat, the ones he had picked up from an all-night florist on his way back from the hotel. Peace offerings had become routine. Roses after a late night, jewelry after a missed dinner, a designer bag after he had failed to show up for her final ultrasound. Grant climbed the porch steps, his Italian loafers clicking against the painted wood. He reached for the door handle, turned it, and felt resistance. Locked. He tried his key. Nothing. The deadbolt had been changed. His jaw tightened. He knocked. 3 firm raps that echoed in the morning stillness. Vivian. He called out. His voice was calm, practiced. Baby, I know you are upset. Let me in so we can talk about this. Silence answered him. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. A knot began to form in his stomach. Something cold and unfamiliar. Grant walked to the side of the house, tried the back door. Locked. The kitchen was dark. The whole house felt abandoned, like it had been holding its breath. When he returned to the front porch, he noticed something he had missed before. Sitting on the railing, tucked behind the potted hydrangeas, was a small, clear plastic bracelet. He picked it up and read the words printed on it. Baby boy Calloway, born April 17th, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. His son's hospital bracelet. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper. Grant opened it with trembling fingers. Vivian's handwriting, neat and precise as always. You missed his first breath. You will not miss his last. Grant read the words 3 times. His hand dropped to his side. The roses slipped from his grip and scattered across the porch, red petals against white paint like drops of blood. He tried her phone again. Voicemail. He sent a text. Vivian, please tell me where you are. We can work this out. Whatever you think you know, I can explain. No response. He walked to the front window and pressed his face against the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes. The living room was empty, but undisturbed. Her coat was gone from the hook by the door. The diaper bag was missing from its usual spot by the stairs. She had left. Not in a rage, not throwing things and screaming. She had packed methodically and walked out the door while he was wrapped around another woman in a hotel room downtown. Grant sat down heavily on the porch steps. His phone buzzed. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. But it was not Vivian. It was Brooke. Last night was amazing. When can I see you again? He stared at the message, then at the hospital bracelet still clutched in his other hand. His son had been born 3 days ago. He had held him exactly once, for a photo Vivian had insisted on taking. He could not remember if the baby had his eyes or hers. Grant deleted Brooke's message and tried Vivian again. Voicemail. He sat on those steps as the sun rose over Charleston, painting the historic street in shades of gold and pink. Joggers passed by. A neighbor walked her dog. The garbage truck rumbled through. The world moved on as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Grant had spent 15 years building his empire. Calloway Development owned half the commercial real estate in the city. He had politicians in his pocket, journalists on his payroll, and a reputation that opened every door. He had never met a problem he could not solve with money or charm. But Vivian had not asked for money. She had not screamed or threatened or begged. She had simply left a note and disappeared. That terrified him more than anything. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his assistant, reminding him of a 9 o'clock board meeting. He ignored it. He stood up, walked to the welcome mat, and lifted it. The spare key was still there. She had left it on purpose. Not to hide anything, but to show him there was nothing left to find. Grant unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled like her perfume and baby powder, and something else he could not name. Loss, maybe, or consequence. He walked through the empty rooms like a ghost. The nursery was pristine, the crib made up with sheets that had never been slept in. She had taken everything the baby needed: clothes, bottles, the breast pump, the car seat. She had been thorough. In their bedroom, he found the closet half empty. Her side was bare except for a few formal dresses she never wore anyway. Her jewelry box was gone. So were the photo albums. On the bathroom counter, she had left behind one thing: her wedding ring. Grant picked it up and held it in his palm. 3 carats, princess cut, the stone he had chosen because it was the biggest in the case. She had worn it for 4 years without complaint. Now it sat in his hand like an accusation. He walked back downstairs and stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by furniture they had picked out together, art they had purchased on their honeymoon, a life they had built that now felt like a stage set. Vivian had not always been the kind of woman who changed locks and disappeared. 3 days ago, she had still been trying to believe the lies. But 3 days ago, she had also given birth alone while he was ordering champagne with his mistress. Grant pulled out his phone and made one more call. Not to Vivian, to his lawyer, Richard. He said when the man answered, "I need you to freeze the joint accounts. All of them. My wife has left, and I need to protect my assets." He listened to the response, nodded once, and hung up. Whatever game Vivian thought she was playing, Grant Calloway did not lose. He never had. He never would. But somewhere across the city, in a small apartment that smelled like coffee and hope, Vivian Calloway was holding her newborn son and making plans of her own. And she was done playing games entirely. 3 days earlier, Vivian Calloway stood in the nursery, running her hand along the edge of the white wooden crib. The room smelled like fresh paint and new fabric, the scent of beginnings. She was 39 weeks pregnant, her belly heavy and low, her back aching with a persistence that had become background noise. The mobile above the crib played a soft lullaby when she wound it. Tiny elephants spun in lazy circles. She had picked it out herself, like everything else in this room. The sage green walls, the cream-colored curtains, the rocking chair in the corner where she imagined herself nursing at 3 in the morning while Grant slept down the hall. Grant slept down the hall because he said her tossing and turning kept him awake. He needed his rest for work. She understood. She always understood. Her phone rang, and she answered without checking the screen. Grant's voice filled her ear, smooth and apologetic. "Baby, I am so sorry. There is an emergency board meeting in Charlotte. I have to fly out tonight." Vivian lowered herself into the rocking chair, one hand on her belly. "Tonight, but the doctor said I could go into labor any day now." I know. He sighed heavily. "But this deal is worth $40 million. If I do not close it personally, the whole thing falls apart. I will be back tomorrow night. I promise." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that she was scared, that her contractions had been getting stronger, that she needed him here, but the words stuck in her throat. "Okay," she said instead. "I understand. You are amazing. You know that I do not deserve you." After he hung up, Vivian sat in the rocking chair and listened to the elephants spin. She tried to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest, the one that had been growing for months. Grant was busy. He was building something. She had known that when she married him. But lately, something felt different. The late nights had multiplied. The business trips had stretched longer. And there was something in his voice when he called, a distraction, like he was looking at something else while he talked to her. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Margot stood on the porch, holding a casserole dish and wearing an expression that said she had something to say and was going to say it whether Vivian wanted to hear it or not. "I brought dinner," Margot announced. pushing past her into the house. And before you tell me you are not hungry, I saw your husband's car leave an hour ago, so I know you are alone again. He has a meeting in Charlotte, Vivian said, closing the door. Margot set the casserole on the kitchen counter and turned to face her. When is the last time he touched your belly? Vivian blinked. What's your belly? You're giant, beautiful, about to be a baby belly. When is the last time Grant put his hand on it and talked to his son? Vivian opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. She could not remember. Margot's expression softened. Viv, I'm not trying to start a fight, but I have known you for 15 years. I was there when you gave up your law career to support his company. I was there when you moved across the country for his expansion plans. And I have watched you shrink yourself smaller and smaller to fit into whatever shape he needs you to be. That is not fair, Vivian said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe not, but it is true. They ate dinner together in the kitchen, Margot doing most of the talking while Vivian pushed food around her plate. After Margot left, Vivian tried to sleep but could not get comfortable. The baby was pressing on her bladder. Her back felt like it was on fire, and Grant's words kept echoing in her head. Charlotte, emergency meeting, $40 million. At 11:30, she reached for her phone and opened Instagram. She was not sure why. Maybe just to see something other than the ceiling. She scrolled past pictures of friends, vacations, and sponsored posts for products she would never buy. Then she stopped. Brooke Ashford had posted a story. Vivian knew Brooke vaguely, a woman Grant had hired as his director of marketing 2 years ago. Blonde, polished. The kind of woman who looked like she had never experienced an awkward moment in her life. The story showed a restaurant table, candlelit and intimate. The caption read, "Best steak in the South." The location tag said Charleston. Not Charlotte, Charleston. Vivian stared at the screen. Her heart began to pound. It could be a coincidence. Brooke traveled for work constantly. Just because she was in Charleston did not mean anything. But the restaurant in the photo, Vivian recognized it. It was the same restaurant where Grant had proposed to her 4 years ago. The same restaurant he had mentioned in passing last week. We should go back to Magnolia's sometime, he had said. Remember our first date there? She had smiled and said yes. She remembered. Vivian closed Instagram and set her phone on the nightstand. Her hands were shaking. It did not mean anything. It could not mean anything. Grant loved her. He had married her. They were about to have a baby together. She placed her hand on her belly and felt her son kick, strong and insistent. We are fine, she whispered to him. Everything is fine. She told herself that lie until she finally fell asleep. 12 hours later, her water broke on the kitchen floor, and Grant's phone went straight to voicemail. The first contraction hit at 2:17 in the morning. Vivian was standing at the kitchen sink, filling a glass of water, when a wave of pressure rolled through her abdomen. She gripped the counter and breathed through it, counting the seconds until it passed. 20 minutes later, another one came, then 15 minutes, then 10. She called Grant at 3 in the morning. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Grant, it is me. I think I am in labor. Please call me back. She tried again at 3:15. Voicemail. At 3:30, she texted him. My water just broke. I am going to the hospital. Please come. No response. By 4 in the morning, the contractions were 5 minutes apart and strong enough to make her double over. She stood in the hallway, keys in hand, trying to decide if she could drive herself or if she needed to call an ambulance. She called Margot instead. The phone rang twice before Margot's sleepy voice answered. Viv, what is wrong? The baby is coming, Vivian said, her voice breaking. And Grant is not answering his phone. I am on my way. Margot arrived in 12 minutes, still wearing pajamas, her hair in a messy bun. She took one look at Vivian and shifted into crisis mode. Can you walk good? Lean on me. We are going to get you to the car. The drive to the hospital was a blur of streetlights and contractions. Vivian gripped the door handle and tried to breathe the way the books had taught her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Stay calm, stay focused. But all she could think about was Grant's phone going to voicemail. Where was he? Why was he not answering at the hospital? Everything moved quickly. Nurses appeared with wheelchairs and clipboards. Someone asked about her birth plan. Someone else asked about her husband. He is on his way, Vivian said automatically. but he was not on his way. She tried his phone 3 more times from the hospital bed. Voicemail every time. The contractions grew stronger, closer together. The pain became a living thing, wrapping around her spine and squeezing until she could not think. Margot held her hand through all of it. 14 hours of labor. Margot beside her, coaching her through every contraction, wiping sweat from her forehead, telling her she was strong, she was brave, she could do this. At 4:47 in the afternoon, Theodore Grant Calloway entered the world screaming. The nurse placed him on Vivian's chest, and for a moment the entire universe contracted to this single point. His tiny face, red and wrinkled. His fingers, impossibly small. His eyes, squeezed shut against the light. "Hello," she whispered through her tears. "Hello, my love." Margot was crying too, standing beside the bed with her phone clutched in her hand. Her expression shifted, though something flickered across her face. Concern, or maybe anger. "Viv," she said quietly, "there is something you need to see." "Not now," Vivian said, unable to look away from her son. I know the timing is terrible, but you need to see this." Margot held out her phone. On the screen was a photo, forwarded from someone in their social circle. The image showed a hotel bar, soft lighting, leather chairs, and in the center of the frame, Grant Calloway. He was sitting at a table with Brooke Ashford. His hand was on her thigh. She was leaning into him, laughing at something he had said. The timestamp in the corner read 2:15 p.m., 3 hours ago, while Vivian was screaming through contractions, begging the nurses for more ice chips, asking every 10 minutes if anyone had heard from her husband. He was 2 miles away, drinking cocktails with another woman. Vivian stared at the photo. She looked down at her son, still warm against her chest. She looked back at the photo. Something inside her did not break. It calcified. She handed the phone back to Margot and kissed the top of her baby's head. "His name is Teddy," she said. "Not Theodore, just Teddy." Margot wiped her eyes. "That is a perfect name." Grant finally called at 11 that night. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "Baby, I am so sorry. My phone died and I could not find a charger, but I am on my way to the hospital right now." "How is the baby? Is everything okay?" Vivian listened to him lie. She counted the pauses, the practiced inflections, the way he said everything without saying anything at all. "The baby is fine," she said. "I named him Teddy." "That is wonderful. I cannot wait to meet him. I will be there in 20 minutes. She hung up before he could say anything else. Margot was watching her carefully. "What are you going to do?" Vivian looked down at Teddy, at his tiny hand wrapped around her finger. "I am going to smile when he walks through that door. I am going to let him hold his son and take pictures for Instagram. And then I am going to find out exactly how deep this goes." And then Vivian did not answer, but her eyes had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by something harder, something that had been born in this hospital room alongside her son. "Then he is going to find out what happens when you underestimate me." Vivian came home from the hospital 2 days later, smiling for the photographs Grant insisted on taking. He carried Teddy's car seat up the porch steps while she followed behind, moving slowly, her body still aching from delivery. The house was filled with flowers, roses, lilies, an elaborate arrangement of white orchids that must have cost a fortune. Cards from Grant's business associates lined the mantel. "Welcome, baby Calloway. Congratulations on your new arrival." Grant played the doting father for the cameras. He hired a professional photographer to capture their first week at home. He posted pictures on social media with captions about being blessed and grateful and in love with his beautiful family. Vivian smiled in every single photo and every single night. After Grant fell asleep in the guest room where he had been staying for months, she sat at the kitchen table and searched for the truth. It started with his laptop password. She tried his birthday, their anniversary, the date they met. Nothing worked. Then she tried Brooke's birthday, a date she had found on the company website under employee profiles. The screen unlocked. Vivian's hands were steady as she opened his email. She had expected to find evidence of the affair. She had not expected to find a blueprint for her destruction. 8 months of hotel receipts, all charged to his business account. Jewelry purchases that never appeared under the tree at Christmas. A lease agreement for a 2-bedroom condo downtown. signed by Grant enlisting Brooke Ashford as the primary resident. But it was the emails that made her blood run cold. She found a thread between Grant and his lawyer, Richard Sullivan, dated 3 months ago. Grant had written, "If she files for divorce, what are my options for custody?" Richard had replied. "Given your financial resources and her lack of income, you would have significant leverage. If you can establish concerns about her mental health, particularly postpartum issues, you would likely receive primary custody." Grant's response, "Good to know. I will keep that in mind." Vivian read the words 3 times. He had been planning this before the baby was even born. The affair was not a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a strategy. She copied everything, screenshots of emails, photos of receipts, PDFs of the lease agreement. She created a folder on her personal cloud account and named it Insurance. When Grant woke up the next morning, Vivian was in the kitchen making coffee. He kissed her forehead and asked how she had slept. "Better," she said. "I think I am finally adjusting." He smiled and reached for his phone. She watched him scroll through messages, watched his expression flicker when he saw something from Brooke, watched him delete it without reading. "I have to go into the office for a few hours," he said. "Will you be okay alone with Teddy?" "Of course," she said. "We will be fine." After he left, Vivian called Margot. "I've found everything." She said, "He has been planning to leave me for months. He has emails about taking custody of Teddy. He has been building a case against me before I even knew there was a case to fight." Margot was silent for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" "I want to leave. Tonight, if I can. I have enough evidence to bury him in a divorce proceeding." That night, Vivian packed a bag. She moved quietly through the house, gathering essentials, clothes for her and Teddy, important documents, the external hard drive where she had backed up everything from Grant's laptop. She was zipping the suitcase closed when the bedroom door opened. Grant stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Going somewhere?" he asked. Vivian's heart stopped. "I was just organizing some things." He walked toward her slowly. "Funny. Because I got a notification that someone logged into my laptop from an unknown device. And when I checked the browsing history, I found some interesting searches." She did not move. She did not breathe. Grant's voice dropped, cold and controlled. "Did you really think I would not find out?" The next morning, 2 men in white coats arrived at the house. They had paperwork signed by Grant and a doctor Vivian had never met. The diagnosis was severe postpartum psychosis with paranoid delusions. The evaluation was mandatory. 72 hours in a psychiatric facility. For her own safety, they said. For the baby's safety. Vivian screamed as they took Teddy from her arms. She begged. She pleaded. She told them she was not crazy, that her husband was lying, that she had evidence of his crimes. Grant watched from the doorway, his face arranged in perfect concern. "I am so sorry." "Well," he said to the men, "she has been getting worse for days." I did not know what else to do. They put her in the back of a white van. Through the window, she watched Grant pick up their son and carry him back into the house. The last thing she saw before they drove away was his smile. The psychiatric ward smelled like bleach and despair. Vivian sat on a narrow bed in a room painted institutional beige, staring at the wall and counting the hours until she could see her son again. The evaluation took 3 days. 3 days of questions from doctors who looked at her like she was a puzzle to be solved. 3 days of explaining that she was not delusional, that her husband was having an affair, that he had committed her to silence her before she could file for divorce. On the second day, a psychiatrist named Dr. Robert Matthews sat across from her with a clipboard and a patient expression. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "your husband has provided us with detailed documentation of your behavior over the past several weeks. He says you have been experiencing paranoid thoughts, that you accused him of crimes without evidence, that you threatened to harm yourself." Vivian kept her voice steady. "My husband is lying. He is having an affair. I have evidence. He committed me because I was going to leave him." Dr. Matthews made a note. "Do you have this evidence with you?" "It is on my phone, which your staff confiscated when I was admitted." The doctor nodded slowly. "And you believe your husband orchestrated this entire situation to prevent you from divorcing him?" "I do not believe it. I know it." There was a long pause. Dr. Matthews studied her face. "Mrs. Calloway, I have been doing this job for 25 years. I have seen genuine psychosis. I have seen paranoid delusions. And I have also seen women who were telling the truth but were not believed because the men in their lives were convincing liars. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. She had not cried once since they brought her here. She had been too angry, too focused on survival. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I am saying that after 72 hours of observation, I see no evidence of psychosis. You are lucid, coherent, and appropriate. Whatever your husband told us, it does not match what I see in front of me." He signed her release papers that afternoon. Vivian walked out of the facility into blinding sunlight. Margot was waiting in the parking lot, pacing beside her car. "Thank God," Margot said, pulling her into a hug. "I have been calling every lawyer in the city. I have been trying to get emergency custody hearings scheduled. I have been losing my mind." "Where is Teddy?" Margot's expression darkened. "Grant has him. He filed for emergency temporary custody while you were inside. The judge granted it based on your hospitalization." Vivian felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "He took my son, temporarily. We can fight this, but Viv, there is more." They drove to Margot's apartment, a cozy two-bedroom in the Arts District that smelled like jasmine and strong coffee. Vivian sat on the couch while Margot laid out the damage. The joint accounts were frozen. Grant had filed a motion claiming she was a flight risk and a danger to their assets. Her credit cards had been canceled. Her car, which was in Grant's name because he had insisted it was easier for tax purposes, had been repossessed. She had $47.83 in her personal savings account, the one she had kept since college, the one Grant never knew about. Vivian stared at the numbers on Margot's laptop screen. Everything else was gone. "He took everything," she whispered. "He thinks he did," Margot said, "but he does not know about the evidence you backed up. He does not know that I already contacted Douglas Vance." "Who is Douglas Vance?" "The best divorce attorney in South Carolina. He has handled cases against men like Grant before. And he agreed to meet with us tomorrow." Vivian looked down at her empty hands. 48 hours ago. She had been holding her son. Now she had nothing. No money, no home, no baby. The tears came then, huge racking sobs that shook her entire body. She curled into a ball on Margot's couch and wept until she could not breathe. Margot held her through all of it. When the tears finally stopped, Vivian wiped her face and sat up. "I gave up everything for him," she said. "My career, my savings, my name, and he used my son as a weapon against me." "I know," Margot said quietly. Vivian's jaw tightened. "Then let us make him regret it." The next morning, she put on the only professional outfit she had managed to grab before her world collapsed. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her cheekbones stood out too sharply. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else. Rage, cold and clear and patient. She walked into Douglas Vance's office at 9 o'clock sharp, ready to begin her war. Douglas Vance's office overlooked Charleston Harbor, the water glittering beneath a cloudless sky. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of human cruelty and learned not to flinch. He listened to Vivian's story without interruption. When she finished, he steepled his fingers and studied her face. "Your husband made one critical mistake," he said. "He put the condo lease in reading. He signed a legal document that proves he was funneling marital assets to another woman. That is fraud." Vivian leaned forward. "What can we do with that first? We file for emergency financial relief. We argue that you have been deliberately impoverished to prevent you from leaving the marriage. Second, we petition to have the psychiatric hold expunged from your record. The evaluating doctor has already stated you showed no signs of psychosis. Third, we file for custody. Can we win?" Douglas met her eyes. "I will not lie to you, Mrs. Calloway. Your husband has money, connections, and a team of lawyers whose sole purpose is to bury people like you. This will be a fight, but I have handled cases against men like him before, and I have won." Vivian nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Everything. Every email you saved, every screenshot, every receipt. I need a complete timeline of his behavior, his lies and his manipulation, and I need you to be prepared for him to hit back hard." The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. Vivian moved into Margot's guest room permanently and turned the small space into a war room. Papers covered every surface. Timelines and charts lined the walls. She worked 18-hour days, documenting every detail of her marriage. Douglas hired a private investigator named Morrison, a former detective with a nose for hidden assets. Within a week, he had confirmed what Vivian already suspected. Grant and Brooke were still seeing each other. They met at the same hotel every Thursday night. They had dinner reservations at restaurants across the city. Grant was not even trying to hide it anymore. 2 weeks into the investigation, Vivian received an unexpected phone call. Mrs. Calloway. The voice was elderly, refined. "This is Eleanor Calloway." Vivian nearly dropped the phone. Grant's mother, the woman who had barely spoken to her throughout her entire marriage, who looked at her like she was furniture, who had once told Grant he could have done better. "I would like to meet with you," Eleanor said. "There are things you need to know." They met at a tea shop in the historic district, the kind of place where wealthy women went to be seen. Eleanor was already seated when Vivian arrived, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture impeccable. "You look tired," Eleanor said by way of greeting. "I have had a difficult month." Eleanor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Sit down, please. I will not waste your time with pleasantries." Vivian sat. "My son has done this before," Eleanor said quietly. "Not the affair, the rest of it, the manipulation, the legal weaponization, the psychiatric holds." Vivian's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, before you, there was another woman?" "Grant was engaged to her for 2 years. When she tried to leave, he had her committed. He nearly destroyed her reputation. She eventually dropped everything and disappeared rather than continue fighting him." "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor looked out the window at the cobblestone street. "Because I stayed silent then. I told myself it was not my business, that she must have provoked him somehow. I let my son become the man he is." She turned back to Vivian. "I will not make that mistake again." She pulled a manila envelope from her purse and slid it across the table. "Inside, you will find financial records from the past 5 years, hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands. Shell companies used to move money offshore. My son is not just unfaithful. Mrs. Calloway, he is a fraud." Vivian opened the envelope with trembling hands. The documents inside were devastating. Account numbers, transfer records, proof that Grant had been hiding millions from both his company and his wife. "Why do you have these?" she asked. "Because I have been preparing for this moment for years. I just never had the courage to use them." Eleanor stood and gathered her things. "Fight him," she said. "Fight him with everything you have. And when you win, make sure he understands that his own mother helped bring him down." She walked out without looking back. 2 days later, Douglas filed the emergency motion. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Vivian allowed herself, for the first time, to feel something like hope. The judge reviewed the evidence for 3 hours. He looked at the financial records, the lease agreement, the emails, the testimony from Dr. Matthews about the fraudulent psychiatric hold. When he delivered his ruling, Vivian wept. Emergency sole custody was granted to the mother. All frozen accounts were to be immediately restored. The father was ordered to have no contact with the minor child until a full custody hearing could be conducted. Vivian held Teddy for the first time in 3 weeks. She sobbed into his tiny shoulder while Margot cried beside her. The nightmare was over. Except it was not over. Not even close. 48 hours later, a gossip blog published an exclusive story. The headline read, "Calloway heir born to mentally unstable mother psychiatric. Hold documents leaked." Someone had given them her medical records, illegally obtained and publicly displayed. The comments section was vicious. "Crazy, unfit, gold digger. Women should not be allowed to use babies as weapons." Grant gave a tearful interview to a local news station. "I just want what is best for my son," he said, his eyes glistening with practiced emotion. "Her mental health issues are not her fault, but they are real. I am doing everything I can to protect our family." The next morning, Child Protective Services showed up at Margot's door for a welfare check. Vivian stood in the doorway, Teddy in her arms, and realized the truth. She had won in court, but Grant was fighting a different war entirely. And in that war, perception was everything. The courthouse felt different the second time. Colder. The wood benches were harder, the fluorescent lights harsher. Vivian sat beside Douglas Vance and watched Grant's legal team file into the room like an invading army. The judge, a woman named Patricia Winters, reviewed the new filings with an expression that revealed nothing. When she looked up, her voice was measured. Mr. Calloway's attorneys have filed a motion to modify the emergency custody order. She said, they cite concerns about public safety and the child's welfare, based on recent media coverage in a petition signed by over 300 community members. Vivian's stomach dropped. 300 people had signed a petition against her. People who had never met her, who knew nothing about her except what Grant had fed to the press. Douglas stood. Your Honor, the media coverage in question was based on illegally obtained medical records. My client was cleared by the evaluating psychiatrist. There is no evidence of any danger to the child. Judge Winters raised an eyebrow. I am inclined to agree with that assessment. However, the court must also consider the broader circumstances. Given the level of public attention this case has attracted, I am modifying the custody arrangement temporarily. Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. The mother will retain primary custody, the judge continued. However, the father will be granted supervised visitation twice per week. A court-appointed social worker will be present during all exchanges. Douglas started to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. This is not a punishment. Mr. Vance, this is a precaution. I want this child's welfare to be above reproach when the final custody determination is made. Grant smiled from across the courtroom. It was the smile of a man who had just won something. The first supervised visitation took place 4 days later. Vivian had to meet Grant at a family services center, hand Teddy over to him in front of a social worker, and then sit in a waiting room for 4 hours while her son was held by the man who had tried to destroy her. Grant leaned close to her during the handoff, close enough that only she could hear. See how easy it is to take everything from you, he whispered. She did not respond. She simply watched him walk away with her child. The second catastrophe came a week later. Margot called her from her office, her voice shaking. I lost the Henderson account, she said, in the Morrison wedding, and the Calloway Foundation gala. Vivian's heart sank. That is 3 of your biggest clients. I know. They all canceled within 48 hours of each other. And get this, they all used the same excuse. Budget concerns. Margot paused. But the Henderson family just bought a yacht last month. She continued, and the Morrisons are spending $2 million on their daughter's wedding. They do not have budget concerns. Vivian closed her eyes. He is punishing you for helping me. There is more. My landlord called this morning. He is not renewing my commercial lease. The building just got bought by a new investment group. Want to guess which one? Calloway Development. Margot laughed, but there was no humor in it. He is trying to isolate you. Break down everyone around you until you have no one left. Vivian looked at Teddy, asleep in his bassinet. I am so sorry, Margot. You should not be losing everything because of me. Stop it, Margot said firmly. I am not going anywhere. We are going to figure this out together. The third catastrophe was the worst. Vivian's parents called on a Sunday morning. Her father's voice was strange, hesitant. Sweetheart, he said, your mother and I have been talking about you and Grant. Vivian braced herself. He came to see us last week. He was very upset. He told us about your mental health struggles, about the doctors, about everything that has been happening. Dad, that is not true. He is lying. There was a long pause. He paid off our mortgage, her father said quietly. He knew about my medical bills. He knew we were struggling. He said he wanted to help, that families should take care of each other. Vivian could not breathe. He bought you. That is not fair. Her mother cut in. He is worried about you, about the baby. He just wants everyone to work together to find a solution. The solution is for me to go back to him, Vivian said flatly. That is what he wants. That is what you are asking me to do. Silence. Sweetheart, her mother said gently. Maybe if you just talked to him. Maybe if you apologized. Tried a little harder to meet him halfway. Vivian hung up without saying goodbye. She sat on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m, holding her phone, staring at the screen. The crisis hotline number was saved in her contacts. Margot had insisted she keep it there, just in case. She was not suicidal. She did not want to die. But she did not know how to keep living like this. Every direction she turned, Grant was there, blocking every exit, buying every ally, controlling every narrative. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered without thinking. Mrs. Calloway. The voice was female, tearful. "This is Brooke Ashford." Vivian's grip tightened on the phone. "I know you have no reason to trust me." Brooke continued, "I know I helped him do terrible things to you, but I need to talk to you. Please. He is doing the same thing to me now." "What do you mean I just found out I am pregnant? And when I told Grant, he said I needed to handle it or he was done with me." Vivian stared at the wall. The same woman who had helped destroy her life was now on the other end of the phone, crying. "Meet me tomorrow," Vivian said, "and bring everything you have." The coffee shop was nearly empty at 9 in the morning. Vivian chose a table in the back corner, away from the windows, away from anyone who might recognize them. She arrived 15 minutes early and sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she did not intend to drink. Brooke walked in at exactly 9 o'clock. She looked different than she had in the Instagram photos. Smaller, somehow. Her makeup was smudged under her eyes, and she moved with the hesitant steps of someone who expected to be turned away. She sat down across from Vivian without ordering anything. "Thank you for meeting me," she said quietly. Vivian studied her face. "I did not do it for you. I know." Brooke folded her hands on the table. "I know you hate me. You should hate me. What I did was unforgivable. Then why are you here?" Brooke reached into her purse and pulled out a thick folder. She slid it across the table. "Because Grant told me you were crazy," she said. "He told me you had trapped him, that you were vindictive and unstable, that your marriage was over long before I came along, and you believed him." "I wanted to believe him," Brooke admitted. "He was charming and attentive, and he made me feel like I was the only person in the world." She laughed bitterly. "I know how stupid that sounds." Vivian opened the folder. Inside were printouts of emails, text messages, photos, evidence of the affair, yes, but also something more. Records of payments Grant had made to a journalist. Screenshots of conversations where he discussed leaking Vivian's medical records. A recording, saved to a flash drive, of Grant telling Brooke exactly how he planned to take custody of Teddy. "Why did you keep all this?" Vivian asked. "Because I am not stupid," Brooke said. "I knew who he was. I just did not want to admit it until he pointed that cruelty at me." Vivian looked up. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. I deserve nothing from you. I just want you to have these, use them however you need to. You know, if I take this to court, your name will be everywhere. Your career will be over." Brooke's jaw tightened. "My career is already over. He made sure of that the moment I told him about the pregnancy. I am just collateral damage to him. Same as you were." Vivian sat back in her chair. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Vivian said, "I'm not going to forgive you. I am not asking you to. Good. Because what you did to me, helping him, believing his lies, letting him use you as a weapon, I will never forget that." Brooke nodded. "I would not expect you to." Vivian gathered the folder and stood. "But I will take this evidence," she said, "and I will destroy him with it. That is the only thing we have in common." She walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. The next 2 weeks were a flurry of activity. Douglas reviewed Brooke's evidence and confirmed it was admissible. The recording alone was enough to prove Grant had deliberately fabricated the psychiatric evaluation. Eleanor Calloway provided additional financial records, including proof that Grant had used company funds to pay for Brooke's condo. That was not just a civil matter. That was criminal. Morrison, the private investigator, tracked down Rachel, a former assistant of Grant's who had left the company 3 years ago. She agreed to provide a statement confirming that Grant had a pattern of targeting vulnerable women and using legal intimidation to silence them. The case against Grant Calloway was no longer just about divorce. It was about fraud, obstruction of justice, and abuse of process. Douglas filed the motions on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Grant's lawyer called requesting a meeting. Vivian sat across from Grant in Douglas's conference room. It was the first time she had been in the same room with him since the custody exchange. He looked older than she remembered, tired. The charm that had once dazzled her now seemed hollow. "What do you want?" he asked. "Full custody," Vivian said. "All of it. Legal and physical. That is not going to happen." "It is going to happen," Douglas interjected, "because the alternative is a criminal referral to the district attorney. Your financial records show clear evidence of fraud. Your communications with Miss Ashford prove you falsified medical documentation to have your wife committed, and we have testimony from multiple witnesses about your pattern of behavior." Grant's face went pale. You have two choices, Vivian said. Sign away your parental rights, agree to a financial settlement, and walk away. Or fight this in court and watch your entire life burn down around you. You would not dare. Vivian leaned forward. 3 months ago, you put me in a psychiatric ward to shut me up. You took my son from my arms. You bought my parents and destroyed my best friend's business. She let the words hang in the air. I would dare anything. Grant looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at the floor. The meeting ended without a decision. But Vivian knew. She had seen the fear in his eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, Grant Calloway was not the one in control. The final hearing took place on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day that felt like it could not decide whether to rain or clear. Vivian dressed in a navy blazer and simple pearl earrings, the same ones she had worn to her law school graduation years ago. They felt like armor now. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the Calloway case, and journalists lined the back rows with notebooks and recording devices. Grant's former business partners sat on one side, their faces carefully neutral. Eleanor Calloway sat on the other, her presence a statement that needed no explanation. Judge Patricia Winters entered, and everyone rose. We are here for the final custody determination in the matter of Calloway versus Calloway, she began. I have reviewed all submitted evidence and testimony. However, I would like to give both parties an opportunity to make final statements before I deliver my ruling. Douglas nodded to Vivian. She stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. Her hands were steady. Her voice did not shake. Your Honor, she said, 3 months ago, I gave birth to my son while my husband was with another woman. When I discovered his affair and tried to leave, he had me committed to a psychiatric facility using falsified documentation. He froze my bank accounts. He took my child. He destroyed my best friend's business. He even bought my own parents' silence. She paused and looked directly at Grant. My husband is a skilled manipulator, she continued. He is charming and successful and knows exactly how to make people believe his version of events. For years, I believed him too. I believed I was difficult. I believed I was the problem. I believed that if I just tried harder, loved better, gave more, he would finally see me. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. But I was never the problem. The problem was a man who saw his wife and child as possessions to be controlled, not people to be loved. A man who weaponized the legal system to punish me for daring to leave. A man who thought money and power made him untouchable. She turned back to the judge. I am not asking for revenge, Your Honor. I am asking for safety. For my son and for myself. Grant Calloway is not a father. He is a threat, and I am asking this court to protect us from him. She sat down. Margot squeezed her hand. Grant's attorney rose and delivered a brief statement about his client's commitment to fatherhood and his willingness to undergo counseling. The words sounded hollow in the silent courtroom. Then Judge Winters spoke. I have presided over many custody cases in my career, she said. I have seen genuine conflicts between loving parents who simply could not make their marriage work. This is not one of those cases. She looked at Grant. Mr. Calloway, the evidence presented in this proceeding paints a disturbing picture. You systematically isolated your wife from financial resources, social support, and ultimately her own child. You weaponized mental health stigma to discredit her. You used your considerable wealth and influence to manipulate every system designed to protect vulnerable people. Grant's face was stone. This court has a responsibility to protect children from harm. The judge continued, and it is clear to me that the greatest source of harm in this child's life is you. She straightened her papers. I am granting full legal and physical custody to Vivian Calloway. The father's parental rights are hereby terminated, pending his acceptance of the proposed settlement terms. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into potential criminal charges, including fraud and abusive process. The gavel came down. Vivian did not cry. She did not celebrate. She simply sat very still and let the words wash over her. It was over. Grant stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He started to move toward Vivian, but two bailiffs intercepted him. Viv, he called out, please, I can change. I love you. Vivian stood and faced him. You do not know what love is, she said quietly. You only know what possession feels like. and I am not your possession anymore. She walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Outside, the clouds had parted. Weak sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the courthouse steps. Margot was waiting with Teddy in her arms. Vivian took her son and held him close, breathing in his scent, feeling his warmth against her chest. A journalist approached with a microphone. "Mrs. Calloway, do you have a statement?" Vivian thought for a moment. "Believe women," she said finally. "Believe them when they tell you something is wrong, even when, especially when, the man is powerful. That is all I have to say." She walked down the steps and into the rest of her life. 6 months later, Vivian stood at the window of her new apartment, watching the sun rise over Charleston Harbor. The space was small, just 2 bedrooms and a galley kitchen, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall, every dish in the cabinet, she had chosen it all herself. Teddy was awake in his crib, babbling to himself in the musical language of babies. She could hear him through the monitor, his voice rising and falling in patterns that almost sounded like conversation. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, enjoying the quiet before the day began. In an hour, she would drop Teddy at daycare and drive to her new office at the Legal Aid Society, where she had taken a position helping domestic abuse survivors navigate the court system. The pay was a fraction of what she had once earned as a corporate attorney, but the work mattered in ways her old career never had. Her phone buzzed. A text from Margot. "Brunch Saturday, I found a place with bottomless mimosas and a kids menu." Vivian smiled and typed back, "Perfect. Teddy loves when his auntie gets tipsy and sings show tunes." Margot's business had recovered slowly over the past few months. She had lost some clients permanently, but others had returned once the truth about Grant came out. She was rebuilding, one event at a time. They both were. At 9 o'clock, Vivian carried Teddy down to her car, a modest sedan she had purchased with money from the divorce settlement, and when Grant had fought the financial terms viciously. But in the end, the evidence was too overwhelming. He had agreed to a structured payout that would ensure Teddy's future was secure. As for Grant himself, Vivian tried not to think about him too often. The last she had heard, he was facing federal fraud charges related to the offshore accounts Eleanor had exposed. The Callaway Development Board had removed him as CEO, and he was living in his mother's pool house while awaiting trial. She did not feel satisfaction at his downfall. She felt nothing at all, which she supposed was a kind of victory. Eleanor sent a birthday card for Teddy every month, even though his birthday was only once a year. Inside each card was a handwritten note, always the same message: "I am proud of you both." Vivian was not sure what to do with those cards, so she kept them in a box in her closet. Maybe someday they would mean something. Maybe not. Brooke had her baby, a little girl she named Rose. Vivian saw the birth announcement on social media, a simple photo of a tiny hand gripping Brooke's finger. There was no father mentioned, no family gathered around, just Brooke and her daughter, alone together. Vivian did not reach out. She did not need to. Some chapters were meant to stay closed. Her parents had sent a letter last month, an apology, of sorts. Her father had written most of it, his handwriting shaky from the medication he was taking. "We were wrong," he had written. "We let fear make our decisions. We hope someday you can forgive us." Vivian had not responded yet. She was not sure she ever would. Forgiveness was not something she owed anyone, not even family. At the daycare, Teddy reached for her face as she unbuckled him from his car seat. He was 10 months old now, with her dark hair and what she liked to think were her eyes. He smiled easily and laughed often, the kind of baby who seemed determined to find joy in everything. She kissed his forehead. "I love you, little man. I will see you this afternoon." He babbled something that might have been a word and might have been nonsense. Either way, it made her heart ache with a love so fierce it sometimes frightened her. At the office, Vivian met with her first client of the day, a woman named Sandra, mid-30s, with bruises she tried to hide under long sleeves. Her husband was a respected businessman in the community. No one believed he was capable of violence. "Tell me everything," Vivian said gently. "Take your time. I am listening." And she did listen. For 2 hours, she sat with Sandra and heard her story. The story of a woman trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but was rotting from within. When Sandra finished, Vivian leaned forward. "I believe you," she said, "and we are going to fight this together." Sandra burst into tears. It was the first time anyone had said those words to her. That evening, Vivian picked up Teddy from daycare and drove to their favorite spot, a small park overlooking the harbor. She spread a blanket on the grass and let Teddy crawl around, grabbing fistfuls of clover and shoving them toward his mouth. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and pink. A sailboat drifted past, its white sails catching the last light. Vivian thought about the woman she had been a year ago. The woman who had smiled through pain, who had shrunk herself to fit into someone else's idea of a perfect wife, who had been so afraid of being alone that she had accepted being controlled instead. That woman was gone now. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had walked through fire and emerged on the other side, scarred but standing. She looked at Teddy, who was currently trying to eat a dandelion. "People ask me if I am happy now," she said to him, even though he could not understand. "That is the wrong question." She picked him up and held him against her chest. "I am whole," she whispered. "I am standing. And for the first time in years, I do not need anyone's permission to exist." Teddy grabbed her nose and giggled. Vivian laughed, the sound surprising her. It had been so long since she had laughed without thinking about it first. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear. Somewhere in the city, Grant Calloway was preparing for a trial that would likely end his career and his freedom. Somewhere else, Eleanor was sitting alone in a mansion full of regret. And somewhere, Brooke was rocking her daughter to sleep, trying to figure out how to build a life from the wreckage. But here, on this blanket, in this park, Vivian Calloway was finally at peace. Grant Calloway thought he married a woman he could control. He created a woman who would destroy him. And now, that woman was free. The courtroom was smaller this time, less formal. Vivian sat in the gallery, watching as the prosecutor delivered closing arguments in the case of United States versus Grant Calloway. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, tax evasion, obstruction of justice. The offshore accounts Eleanor had exposed led investigators to an entire network of shell companies and hidden assets. Grant sat at the defense table, thinner than she remembered, his expensive suit hanging loose on his frame. He did not look at her. He had not looked at anyone throughout the entire trial. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a verdict: guilty on all counts. Vivian watched as Grant was led away in handcuffs. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that justice, imperfect as it was, had been served. Outside the courthouse, Margot was waiting. "How do you feel?" she asked. Vivian considered the question. "Tired," she said, "and ready to go home." Teddy was at Margot's apartment with the babysitter, probably causing chaos with his newfound walking skills. He was 18 months old now, sturdy and curious and absolutely fearless. He had started saying words: "Mama," "No," "More," "Cookie." He did not know his father. He probably never would. Some nights, Vivian worried about what she would tell him when he was older. How do you explain to a child that the man who helped create him was also the man who tried to destroy his mother? But those were problems for another day. For now, she had learned to live in the present, to take each moment as it came, to find joy in small things. A year ago, she had been broken, lost, convinced that her story was over. Now she knew the truth. Her story was just beginning. Epilogue, word count 318 words. Final total 10, 442 words. Status meets minimum target. Terragan.